In the 1950s, the race was on to build the ultimate weapon, a radar-invisible supersonic aircraft. What was needed was from the realms of science fiction.
The U.S. Air Force, in fact, wanted a new fighter interceptor, something that no Soviet aircraft would look like, a completely new airplane, one that could fly faster and higher than anything else in the air at the time.
In 1953, the CIA discovered that Avro, the Canadian aeronautics company, was working secretly on a revolutionary aircraft, a flying saucer. This was the brainchild of a visionary British aeronautical engineer.
The genius behind the Flying Saucer project was John Frost. He came from England as a designer on another project, but he soon became intrigued with the idea of taking flying saucers into the air.
John Frost had been responsible for one of aviation's most innovative developments, the swept-wing tailless fighter.
The inspiration behind John Frost's first ideas, in fact, came from his collecting a scrapbook of all the UFO reports that were being heralded all over the world. And through looking at every one of the reports, he began to start sifting them down to at least two possible sources. And one was man-made, and he traced it back to Germany.
Frost was intrigued by reports of the Nazi flying saucers.
And in fact, we now have evidence to show that he is a participant in interviewing German scientists, and especially one, Mithe, who had worked directly with German flying saucers.
Dr. Mithe claimed that he had worked for over 10 years on the Nazi saucer program, and his team had actually built a flying prototype. Mithe showed Frost photographs, plans, and blueprints. Frost was convinced that he could turn Mithe's plans into reality.
John Frost had the promise of something that no one else could deliver at that point, a supersonic, more than twice as fast as the speed of sound aircraft that could fly higher and faster than anything else out there and never needed a runway or any airfield to operate from.
In 1952, the Canadian Avro Aircraft Factory concealed one of America's most highly classified and top-secret projects.
John Frost set up a secret group called the Special Projects Group. It was based on men just like himself, engineers and technicians and scientists that would work on his own ideas and ideas that would in fact lead to the flying saucer projects.
One of the aeronautical engineers who worked with John Frost on this revolutionary concept was Doug Garland.
Well, John Frost was frightfully English. You know, he was a typical English gentleman from the public school system, but with tremendous experience in the aviation industry. I'd say his enthusiasm was infectious. No problem was too big. There's a solution to every problem. In fact, we don't have problems, we have challenges. There were plenty of challenges.
John Frost's very first project is Project Y, a spade-shaped aircraft that's based around his circular pancaked engine. It'll be able to take off from the ground vertically or in a rolling takeoff and fly as a supersonic interceptor.
Project Y was designed as a tailless jet engine aircraft. It was in effect using flying saucer technology. A spade-shaped mock-up was built by Frost's elite team in a heavily guarded workshop in the Avro factory. In 1953, a model with a delta tail jet flap for vertical takeoff control was secretly tested. The failings of the design soon became apparent.
One of the main problems with any tail-sitting aircraft would be that the amount of pilot skills that would be required to fly vertically from the ground in that position, and then, in fact, to return would be incredible.
John Frost now concentrated all the efforts of the Special Projects team on the development of a circular design, essentially a flying saucer.
The Circle is the most efficient ground effect machine. You get more lift for a given thrust from the periphery. So it makes sense when you're hovering in ground effect.
John Frost's next design was codenamed Y2.
And Project Y2 is a completely circular aircraft, now using a rotor system in the center of it and multiple engines on the outside edge. powering that rotor, giving it vertical takeoff and eventual direction so it could fly into altitudes that no one else could guess. It was a knife-edge supersonic fighter that he was selling. And at this point, the American Air Force bought in big time with a $10 million grant towards his research.
By 1956, the Cold War space race and arms race was at its height. The American military was desperate to invest in new weapons technologies. With clandestine American funding, the development of the supersonic flying saucer began.
In the Schaefer building was a full-size, 50-foot diameter, 6-engine powered aircraft. Now, testing though proved that it was a dangerous beast, one that nearly killed the entire Frost team.
The test was nearly catastrophic. The engines of the saucer tethered in the hangar spun out of control and almost blew the roof of the research lab off.
John Frost decides that there's no way that he can continue this work with a complete flying saucer. The supersonic project is abandoned for the time being for him to build a smaller test vehicle that becomes the Avro car.
Well, the design specification for the Avro car was to fly at forward speed at 300 miles an hour, some modest kind of speed, but it had a high thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1, and to fly at 30,000 feet altitude, and to land and take off vertically.
In 1957, Frost's prototype model finally rewarded the earlier American military investment in his project.
The Avro car was a scaled-down test vehicle that could do two jobs. One, it could provide a test vehicle for the supersonic craft that was still sitting in the Schaefer building. But secondly, it could be the flying jeep that the U.S. Army required. With weaponry, it could actually go on the battlefield as a battlefield weapon.
In 1959, the two vertical takeoff prototypes rolled out of the factory. The long-term aim was to produce a flying saucer that could reach over 1,500 miles per hour.
It did fly along the runways, de-icing the runways quite nicely, blowing ice and snow around. And it got into trouble over freshly mown part of the airfield when all the grass blew up and came back down in the intakes. And then we started thinking about how to prevent what's called foreign object ingestion into the intakes.
The flying saucer flew several test flights, but its shape meant that it was incredibly difficult to steer.
It was a maze of challenges, and the biggest challenge that the concept faced was the pitch instability, the aerodynamic center being so far forward of the center of gravity. It's not a good recipe for a happy flight.
So the vertical takeoff and hover principle was working. Modifications were made, but lack of power and inadequate control mechanisms were difficulties that had to be overcome if the Avro car was ever to fly as intended.
Apart from the development of powerful pitch control, the only way that we knew to make a circular device stable was to have it spin, like a frisbee today. And the spinning action will impart stability. Some of John Frost's early designs did in fact have large spinning components, and the gyroscopic power of those devices was thought to impart some stability in designs which were thought to go as fast as 3 times the speed of sound.
Frost was convinced he could control the instability problem. But the Americans insisted on adding a swept tail unit. Frost considered this was a betrayal of his original concept. So in December 1961, the $10 million Avro flying saucer program was officially scrapped. But some of the engineers who worked on the project did not totally abandon Frost's dream.
There really is no aerodynamic future for a circular wing subsonically. Supersonically, with a few modifications and tweaking to its shape to make it a little more like a delta wing, one might see a possible outcome.
John Frost always believed his original concept was achievable.
Despite the unfavorable results of the Avro car testing, the work that John Frost had put into the supersonic project showed that in fact it could have flown. And unfortunately, with the money eventually simply stopping, the company shut down the entire project. All the technology went back to the United States, who was the real owners now at that point.